Hello, everyone.
I'm Denise Dora. non.
Test 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, 2. Là, je fais. Ouais. 1, 2, test, 1, 2, test, 1, 2, test, 1, 2, test. Ça, c'est le floor.
You press here, and when you see, hello.
Un, 2, 3, test, 1, 2, 3, test. Je suis sur le canal anglais, 1, 2, 3, test. 1, 2, 3, test. Je passe au canal français.
So, dear friends, let's start. So, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me, on behalf of the Hellenic Republic, to open this fifth session of the Forum on Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law, and to serve as its chair. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Human Rights Council and its president, Ambassador Jörg Lauber, for the trust placed in Greece to preside over this important gathering. This fifth session, originally scheduled to take place in 2024, was postponed for a year by decision of the Human Rights Council, following the liquidity crisis affecting the United Nations Secretariat. For Greece, the principles of democracy, respect for human rights, rule of law are not only fundamental values, they are part of our identity. These values are as relevant today as they were at the dawn of democracy in ancient Athens. And alarmingly, they are facing many of the same challenges. They remain essential pillars for peaceful, just, and inclusive societies, and for a resilient multilateral system. This year's theme of the forum, Democracy and Climate Change, focusing on solutions, could not be timelier. Climate change is not only an environmental challenge, it is a human and democratic one. It affects the most vulnerable first, tests institutions, and demands transparency, participation, and accountability in the way we govern and share resources. As we gather here in Geneva, our collective task is to identify and share practical solutions, solutions that strengthen both our democracies and our planet. Without further delay, I hereby officially declare open the fifth session of the United Nations Forum on Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. Now, as indicated in the opening version of the program of work of the session shared last week and posted on the Forum webpage, it is my pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Jörg Lauber, President of the Human Rights Council, who will deliver his opening statement. Dear Jörg.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, Yannis. Good morning, everybody. High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to be here for this fifth session of the Forum on Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. At the outset, please allow me to express my sincere gratitude to His Excellency Ioannis Gikas, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Greece to the United Nations Office at Geneva, for agreeing to chair this year's forum. The Human Rights Council established this forum as a platform for dialogue and cooperation on the interconnections between human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Each session has reaffirmed that these three principles are mutually reinforcing. None can be sustained without the others. Since its creation, the Forum has served as a space to reflect on how these principles can guide our collective responses to the evolving challenges of our time. The theme of this year's session, Democracy and Climate Change, focusing on solutions, this theme reminds us that the climate crisis is not only an environmental concern, but also a profound human rights and governance issue. Climate change threatens the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, from civil and political to economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development. It endangers rights such as those to life, food, water, housing, or health. Its impacts are felt most acutely by those least responsible and most vulnerable: small island nations, indigenous peoples, rural communities. Addressing these inequalities is not only a moral imperative, it is also a democratic one. The Human Rights Council has long recognized the urgency of this challenge. Since 2008, the Council has adopted 14 resolutions directly related to climate change and human rights, including an annual resolution since 2014. Over the past years, the Council has also adopted a series of resolutions affirming that a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment is essential to the enjoyment of human rights. It has also established the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change to assist states and all stakeholders in translating these commitments into concrete action. I am happy to acknowledge the key role that Elisa Morguera, the current mandate holder, plays in the agenda of this session of the Forum. Through its work, the Council has helped place human rights at the center of global climate discussions, ensuring that our response to climate change is people-centered, inclusive, and grounded in accountability. Yet, as this Forum will discuss, the path forward must also harness the strength of democracy. Open societies, informed participation, and transparent institutions are vital for building the trust and cooperation needed to confront climate challenges effectively. When people can freely express their views, access information, and participate in decision-making, our climate policies are not only fairer, they are stronger and more, pun intended, sustainable. This forum provides a unique opportunity to share human rights-based solutions. How democratic governance can drive just transitions to sustainable economies. How civic participation can lead to more resilient communities. And how the rule of law can safeguard environmental defenders and ensure accountability for climate harm. Dear friends, I would like to reaffirm the long-standing commitment of the Human Rights Council to protect individuals who cooperate with the United Nations and its mechanisms. I count on everybody's cooperation to make sure that all those who dare to speak, to raise alarm, and to bravely defend the rights of their communities, that they can do so without any intimidation or reprisal against themselves or to their communities. Now let us approach this discussion with a spirit of cooperation and innovation. The answers we seek will require dialogue across borders, disciplines, and generations. But above all, they require a renewed commitment to the values that unite us: respect for human dignity, equality, participation, and justice. In closing, I thank all participants for their engagement, and I look forward to the insights and practical recommendations that will emerge from this session to guide the Council, the states, and all stakeholders in advancing a human rights-based, democratic response to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador and President of the Human Rights Council. I now have the honor to give the floor to the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Mr. Chairperson of the Forum, Mr. President, distinguished panelists and distinguished participants, really pleased to be here at this forum. And I welcome very much the focus on solutions to tackle the climate emergency, because we know that human rights, democracy, rule of law are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. They are the foundations for an effective and sustainable climate action, but they are under threat nationally and internationally, and we see this almost every day. Around the world, civil liberties and political rights have declined for 19 years straight, according to Freedom House. Our own work shows that there are restrictions on civic and political space and on press freedom across all regions. According to data gathered by my office, 193 environmental and indigenous human rights defenders were killed or disappeared in 2024. While demagogues thrive on the extremes, communities are polarized. Climate denial, Challenges to science and disinformation continue to spread, amplified on purely regulated social media platforms and fueled by some political and corporate leaders. Some countries are cutting funding for climate and environmental action as their priorities shift and as they are withdrawing from key international agreements, not just key international agreements. Meanwhile, the planet continues to heat up. 2024 was the warmest year on record, exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for the first time. Each year, we consume some 1.7 times more resources than our planet can regenerate. Almost half of humanity lives in climate hotspots where people are 15 times more likely to die of climate-related causes. According to Oxfam, the world's richest 1% are responsible for more carbon emissions than the poorest 66%. And escalating conflicts are devastating our environment. We hardly talk about that. And we know that scientists are warning that they can remake our ecosystems entirely. This is often a forgotten result of wars. Across the world, even countries with established institutions are struggling to act with the speed, fairness, and inclusion this moment demands. And trust is eroding as a result. The climate emergency is a wake-up call for more participatory and effective governance that is based on human rights. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has found that rights-based approaches to climate action lead to better and more sustainable outcomes. Ensuring that climate solutions embrace human rights can guide us to a more sustainable future. And I see 3 areas of action to get us there. First, we need an open civic space, a basic tenet of democracy. It allows communities, especially those most affected by climate change, notably women, to voice their concerns and share their solutions. Involving indigenous peoples in discussions on climate policy is crucial. Their knowledge and approaches hold important lessons for all of us. For example, traditional indigenous practices, including the communal management of forests and fisheries, can mitigate the impact of climate change. And I had a chance to listen to indigenous peoples whenever I went to country visits, precisely to benefit from that collective wisdom. A free and public square enables scientists to safely gather and share evidence for decision-making. It means information is made accessible to people so they can understand the causes and effects of climate change and can make informed choices, whether at the ballot box or in their daily lives. It allows environmental human rights defenders, journalists, and others to shed light on abuses, to tell stories of progress, and hold corporate and political leaders to account. Open dialogue also fosters creativity. Today, the capacity for innovation is at an all-time high, and the transition away from fossil fuel dependency is a laboratory for new ideas which are desperately needed. Democracy is broader than the singular electoral moment. It stands or falls with the people's right to participate meaningfully in the conduct of public affairs. When people are empowered to participate, it builds trust in institutions and helps deliver decisions that work better for everyone. We are seeing some evidence of a link between the number of environmental groups and lower carbon dioxide emissions in places where governments respect civil liberties and are responsive to external influence. I would also like to highlight that there is an urgent need to address the impacts of lobbying and the potential for corporate capture. I hope that this forum will explore these issues further. Second, we need budgets that are anchored in human rights, which can unlock climate action. As you know, we have been advocating for a human rights economy where all policies, from taxation to climate action, keep a clear focus on advancing human rights and protecting the planet. For example, in a human rights economy, states would equitably phase out fossil fuel subsidies. They would instead invest in renewable energy sources, sustainable food systems, and social safety nets to help people adapt and adjust. Investors and businesses would disclose and divest from sectors that are doing irreparable harm to our climate and our environment, including fossil fuels. And third, we need a concerted push at global level for effective climate action and justice based on human rights embedded in rule of law systems at both national and international levels. There have been important developments. For example, the International Court of Justice issued, as you I'm sure have followed, a landmark opinion earlier this year that found that states' human rights obligations apply and are actionable in the context of climate change. Today, 164 countries recognize the right to a healthy environment. The Paris Agreement has certainly driven progress. However, implementation is hampered by an inadequate monitoring framework, purely voluntary commitments, opaque negotiations, and at times limited participation of women, indigenous peoples, youth, and civil society. Human rights principles can also inform climate justice efforts, for example, on righting past wrongs, truth-telling about the harm that has been done, healing, and reconciliation. Distinguished participants, effective climate action goes hand in hand with the full enjoyment of human rights. And to meet the urgency of the moment, we need fact-based governance focused on solutions, not distractions. We need to uphold the principles of participation, transparency, and accountability to drive progress on climate action and justice. We need governance that looks beyond short-term electoral cycles and power grabs and commits to change that is for the benefit of people, planet, and generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank the High Commissioner for his statement. And now we give the floor to Ms. Anna Tony, Chief Executive Officer of the 30th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP30, who will intervene by video link. Ms. Tony.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be able to address the 5th session of the Forum on Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. I'm very sorry for not being able to be there with you, but we're having the pre-COP here in Brasilia, and that's the reason why we are not able to join you in this important session. The topic of climate change, human rights, and the rule of law and justice are becoming closer and closer. They have always been close, but before there wasn't this recognition. But now with the recent rulings of the International Court of Justice, as well as the Inter-American Court of Justice, we can see that these relationships are not only close, but one depends on the other. Combating climate change is also a way to make justice and to protect human rights. And for the first time, the COP presidency has an envoy for human rights and the rule of justice, Denise Dora. And I would like just to start. Thank you for Denise Dora, that is bringing together and bringing this topic to the core of the COP30 presidency. We also have at COP30 the Day of Human Rights and Justice. So I would like with that to invite all of you to come to Belém at COP30 in November so that we can deepen the discussion climate change, combating climate change, democracy, and the rule of law. Thank you very much. Have a great meeting, and I look forward learning from the deliberations of this 5th session. Thank you.
We thank Ms. Tony for these important remarks. And now, also by video link, we give the floor to Ms. Denise Dora, COP30 Special Envoy for Human Rights and Just Transition.
I'm Denise Dora. I'm COP30 Special Envoy for Human Rights and Just Transition. And it's a great pleasure
The interpreters have lost the sound.
So it seems we have to ensure not only just transition, but just transmission. So let's give the floor to Professor Elisa Morguera, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. As many of the other distinguished panelists have already underscored, democracy and the rule of law are essential for protecting human rights in the context of climate change. Meanwhile, climate change itself and the economic interests at the root cause of climate change are significantly undermining our democratic processes with a view to continuing with harmful economic models that are already severely undermining the life-supporting systems on our planet.
Hello, everyone.
And negatively impacting on children, women, older persons, persons with disabilities and health conditions, as well as indigenous peoples and peasants. So that democracy and the rule of law are essential for protecting human rights in the context of climate change was already underscored in my first report to the UN General Assembly last year, which focused on the right of access to information and the right to science. This was also emphasized in the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which relied extensively on my report and very much emphasized how the protection of human rights and particularly access to information and the right to science are essential for our democracies. Access to information is essential for the effectiveness as well as the transparency and inclusiveness of decision-making processes on climate action at all levels. Public authorities at all levels need to have at their disposal sufficient, reliable, and integrated information to understand which foreseeable impacts on human rights and for whom arise from climate change and from proposed response measures. Without such information, authorities are not able to mitigate and adapt to climate change or prevent what are now largely foreseeable negative impacts on human rights, particularly for those in situations of vulnerability. The public, in turn, must be informed about the magnitude of actual and potential negative human rights impacts and risks of climate change and of the response measures, so as to be able to assess for themselves the adequacy of states' responses and business action to effectively protect and respect human rights in the context of climate change. This is essential to support everyone's resilience and adaptive capacities to respond to the adverse impacts of climate change. Literally, it saves lives. Last year, reports to the General Assembly also emphasized the dangers of disinformation campaigns and misleading and false solutions that are being spread or supported by business entities. Greenwashing, factually incorrect statements on carbon neutrality, but also defamation, attacks, and strategic lawsuits against climate human rights defenders and scientists. There are very clear state obligations in relation to climate disinformation and in relation to the intersectional protection of climate change human rights defenders. And these were reiterated and expanded upon by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in its advisory opinion, clearly linked to the essential protection of our democratic processes. Those critical messages were reinforced in my report this year to the Human Rights Council, where I reflected on the extensive independent research on the fossil fuel industry's playbook in particular. This research documents the evolving strategies to keep away the public from the industry's long-standing knowledge of the expected devastating impacts of climate change, including through corporate capture of public spaces and attacks against scientists and defenders. These strategies are yet another layer of human rights violations affecting our rights to information, science, and public participation in decision-making. In and of themselves, they prevent effective protection of human rights and undermine our democracies. But those strategies are fully documented, and we can prevent further negative impacts on human rights. And this is why we need, on the one hand, to proactively prevent further climate obstruction, and on the other hand, undo the effects of decades of those practices that distort still our current public debates on the fossil fuel phase out. Defossilizing knowledge and the production of the evidence base underlying our decisions on climate change, including at the level of the climate COP, is essential to protect human rights in the formation of public opinion and democratic debate from undue and deeply harmful commercial influence. In my most recent report, which I will present to the UN General Assembly later this week, I also point out to the critical importance of the rule of law and democracy for the energy transition. We can and must prevent the widely documented negative impacts on human rights and the environment of some sources, forms, or scales of renewable energy development. The science is available to do so, to make sure that our transition to a renewable-based economy is fully supportive of all dimensions of the human right to a healthy environment. But in most countries, these respect for human rights and this respect for the protection of the environment in the context of renewables is facilitated because renewables are exempted from or subjected to lighter assessment, planning, and public consultation requirements. But departing from the rule of law does not accelerate the energy transition. Rather, an unchecked energy transition misses the opportunities to rely on available science, including indigenous science and local knowledge, as well as human rights evidence and norms, including lived experiences of those who have been most negatively impacted by climate change and some forms of climate action. This is essential to prevent foreseeable harm and ensure effective climate mitigation, as well as reduction of energy poverty and protection of nature, food, water, and health for everyone. In other words, departing from the rule of law undermines the opportunities we have to rethink our economic models together and ensure that we avoid replicating the same assumptions that underpin our current fossil fuel-based economies and their role in bringing about the current planetary crisis we are facing. We must maximize opportunities for democratic debate to support through the energy transition thriving life-supporting systems for humanity, those healthy ecosystems that were emphasized as a critical core of climate action in all the three advisory opinions on state obligations on climate change. We must prevent making the wrong decisions time and again and missing the root causes of the planetary crisis of environmental and economic injustices. This is also emphasized in my new report in relation to the complex questions around sustainability and human rights protection that have arisen from the rush to energy transition minerals. The report points to still not fully acknowledged links between our dependence on fossil fuels and the search for critical minerals. For instance, in relation to the reliance of plastics in the production of electric vehicles or coal-fired power plants for recycling e-waste. Through that, the report points to the need to reflect more deeply beyond simple technological substitutions in our energy systems, focusing on the role of the energy sector and energy inequalities in driving overconsumption and overproduction that will keep us locked into a worsening climate crisis. We need to look deeper, and the report cautions that making decisions on transition minerals based on demand growth projections, they do not distinguish between sectors and technological developments that support us truly towards a safer climate, and other sectors and technological developments that actually contribute to further further climate harm, to further fossil fuel dependency, or energy and material inefficiency, such as militarization and unchecked growth of data centers that must be prevented and very much differentiated. All these findings have been deeply informed by the lived experiences and insights of the human rights holders who have been most affected by climate change and who have shared their knowledge with me. We therefore need to rely on human rights norms to ensure that all our decision-making processes are democratic, transparent, and inclusive, from the co-development of knowledge and evidence base to the co-development of transformative climate solutions. Thank you.
Many thanks to the Special Rapporteur for that. And let's go back to Ms. Denise Dora, COP30 Special Envoy, if you would like to take it from the beginning.
Hello, everyone. I'm Denise Dora. I'm COP30 Special Envoy for Human Rights and Just Transition. And it's a great pleasure to be with you in this 5th session of the Forum on Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law. COP30 is we are very close to COP30 that will happen in Belém in November. In the Brazilian Amazon, and it's a moment where people from around the world will gather to discuss climate action, climate change, the climate challenge, and what we can do to face this challenge and find the best solutions for our countries, for the people, for other species, for the forests, for the animals, for the ocean. And this is our generational responsibility. We are proud to say that the journey to COP30 has been open, participatory, with participation of different groups, and as a special envoy for human rights, together with the special envoy for women, Ms. Janja Lula da Silva, and for the special envoy for racial equality in peripheries, Ms. Jurema Werneck. We have been traveling all over the country to meet people in their daily lives with their real problems, and also to listen from them the best solutions for overcome these problems. We are mostly meeting with women who are the most affected part of the world, the population world, with climate emergencies. We see that women and girls have been suffering a big deal in situations of climate emergencies. And we want to do something very good to find the best solutions for these problems all together. In one of their letters, the Ambassador André Corrêa do Lago has addressed that climate change begins and ends with people. And this is what we believe. And this is our hope for this COP30. And that's why human rights, democracy, and rule of law are so important. We will not achieve a new deal on climate action without human rights, without democracies in our country, without the rule of law in every part of this planet. We need democracy and rule of law for people to participate in the process, to discuss the problems that they are suffering, and together find the best solutions for it. We also need to incorporate in the climate action all the lessons from the human rights experience in the last 70 years. The fact that human rights activists have been so important in making transitions from dictatorships to democracies, to authoritarian regimes, to ones who protect people, are lessons that we need to bring into the climate change discussions, bring to COPs. And this is why I hope you can also join us in Belém, in the Amazon. I hope to see you there. And if not, I hope in your own places, in your own countries and cities, you'll be mobilizing, meeting with communities, traditional people, women, girls, people living in the periphery of the big cities, the ones who are suffering the most with climate change. And all together in a mutirão, which is an indigenous word that means we all together can build something. We find the best solutions for our planet. So I wish you a very productive and effective meeting, and I hope to see you all in Belém and in other climate change gatherings around the world. Thank you very much.
So many thanks to the Special Envoy, and now I give the floor to Ms. Cheryl Lightfoot, Vice Chair of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, President of the Human Rights Council, High Commissioner, distinguished representatives. It's a great honor this morning to address this distinguished forum as Vice Chair of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this very important dialogue today, which reflects our shared commitment to the promotion and protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide. In doing so, we reaffirm the foundational principles of democracy, participation, inclusion, and accountability, which are essential to ensuring that Indigenous voices are not only heard, but meaningfully integrated into decision-making processes at all levels. Biodiversity is essential not only for maintaining climatic stability, but also for supporting all aspects of human coexistence. It underpins both present and future global macroeconomic stability, which are deeply interconnected with democratic principles, environmental sustainability. Moreover, biodiversity is intrinsically linked to cultural diversity. Indigenous peoples are critical allies in protecting human rights and the environment. Thanks to their ancestral scientific knowledge and sustainable practices, the world has managed to preserve part of this biodiversity. The preservation of traditional indigenous knowledge and biological biodiversity can be achieved only by guaranteeing the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples. The dependency of indigenous peoples on biological diversity and their unique role in conserving life on Earth has been recognized by the United Nations through many international instruments. In particular, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, and through provisions of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted by the General Assembly in 2007. The effective exercise and enjoyment of Indigenous peoples' rights appears to have become a matter of urgency, not only for Indigenous peoples, but for our societies at large. The preservation of traditional indigenous knowledge and biological biodiversity can only be achieved by guaranteeing the right to self-determination of indigenous peoples and recognizing the legitimacy and the importance of indigenous peoples' knowledge and lifeways. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including in its preamble, affirms the diverse rights attached to lands, territories, and resources. There is an essential dynamic between the rights of indigenous people to land, territories, and resources, and the right to maintain biodiversity. In addressing the pressing issue of the climate crisis, it is imperative to recognize that indigenous peoples consistently find themselves at the forefront, bearing the consequences that extend to their livelihoods and sustenance. Article 20 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples unequivocally asserts their entitlement to the pursuit of self-sustenance, development, and the unrestricted engagement in traditional and alternative economic endeavors. The expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples has been mandated to assist member states in achieving the goals of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Declaration, in its Article 29, states that indigenous peoples have the right to conservation and protection of their environment and the productive capacity of their lands, territories, and resources. States should ensure that indigenous people's rights are respected when expanding protected areas, mitigating climate change, and carrying out conservation projects. Indigenous peoples should be part of any decision-making in such situations. Recognize and respect the value of indigenous peoples' scientific and technical knowledge, practices, and innovations in green projects. This includes incorporating indigenous knowledge of biodiversity, the environment, and sustainable resource management practices. Despite their contributions to sustainability, indigenous peoples increasingly face profound threats from climate change, biodiversity loss, and unsustainable development. The disruption of ecological functions such as shifts in species distributions, loss of endemic biodiversity, and degradation of seascapes and landscapes all pose existential challenges. These risks are exacerbated by large-scale conservation and climate change mitigation projects, including carbon credit markets and renewable energy projects, which are frequently implemented without respecting indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent. I would like to conclude by saying that the protection of indigenous people's rights is a democratic imperative. The preservation of biodiversity, the fight against climate change, and the safeguarding of cultural heritage all depend on inclusive governance that respects indigenous self-determination and knowledge systems. Democracy at its core demands participation, transparency, and accountability. These principles must guide our collective efforts to ensure that Indigenous peoples are not merely consulted, but are empowered as equal partners in shaping sustainable futures. Upholding their rights is essential to building resilient societies and a healthy planet for generations to come. I thank you.
Thank you for that. And now, last but not least, Ms. Nicole Pons, Global Advocacy Lead of the World's Youth for Climate Justice. We'll
Thank you, Mr. Chair, High Commissioner, distinguished panelists, and of course the Secretariat. Thank you for providing this platform to foster dialogue and cooperation on the interlinked issues of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law in the context of climate change, especially with a focus on solutions. As someone who grew up in the Philippines, in a small town in the Philippines, these kinds of fora are new to me. And I often say my education in these issues didn't primarily take place in university or session halls, but in coastal towns where I witnessed how corporate actors, enabled by weak regulations, were eroding our beaches with profit-only developments. And at the same time, rising seas were swallowing what little coastline remained. So the communities were defending against threats on both fronts. That's how I came to understand coastal encroachment and how we could even begin to address it. Climate change, being a risk multiplier, has exposed even broader injustices in land use and in the failure or even absence of infrastructures meant to respond to climate disasters. Just a few weeks ago, our capital region was literally drowning. Massive flooding paralyzed much of the city when a particularly fierce typhoon hit the country. What's frustrating is that this should come as no surprise. After all, we experience an average of 20 typhoons every year. So a public school teacher, long resigned to floods as a way of life, takes a paddle boat through inundated streets almost every day just to get to school. Those most affected are people without private transportation or gated communities to shield them from these conditions. This reflects how poor governance and laws and policies that fail to center justice and human rights ultimately fail the people. But my goal here today is to hopefully share solutions and good stories as we address these existential threats of our time. For one, the International Court of Justice, in its ruling on the advisory opinion on climate change, affirmed a simple truth of climate justice. Those who did the least to fuel the crisis deserve protection, reparations, and a future. And this historic win was energized and propelled by the Pacific youth, the government of Vanuatu, and amplified by the rest of the world. Truly a testament to the power of the people, the youth and global majority communities who have made the world listen. And in this journey to the world's highest court, I often reflect on significant moments that led to this point. Because the same year Vanuatu announced its historic leadership of the ICJ-AO resolution, my hometown of Cebu was devastated by a super typhoon that crippled our highly urbanized city overnight. In the aftermath of Super Typhoon Odette, an entire city had no electricity, no drinking nor utility water, communication lines were cut off, and this lasted for months. And I've lived this reality. I often go back to this because I've since met young people from the Global South who've had to live through similar experiences on a daily basis. These are not abstractions. These are not abstract laws. And for so many of us, we are forced to adapt and fend for ourselves because we don't have a choice. And we are conditioned to accept these realities. In the Philippines, we are often praised and celebrated for our resilience, but really it is the only way to survive these dire situations in the absence of long-term sustainable solutions. That's why this right here is an important moment, because it is proof that this is not our narrative, and we refuse to be reduced to statistics, not victims, but young leaders for climate justice. And for the world's youth, it's also important to emphasize that we were never separate from these processes and proceedings. By empowering young people, building capacity, and facilitating meaningful participation within regional and domestic legislative and policy processes, we were able to reach governments, leaders, policymakers, as well as frontline advocacy work with civil society organizations. I've witnessed our young members successfully engage with their governments, contributing to progressive arguments in their states' submissions before the courts, advancing principles such as intergenerational equity, and emphasizing human rights arguments in addressing the climate crisis. And now the era of impunity is over and accountability begins. The ICJ advisory opinion is an unprecedented legal and moral breakthrough for climate ambition, and it was led by the most affected. And this moment shows how youth and global South communities have the power to shape international law and seek reparation for damage done. Thank you. I'll end with that.
So thanks so much for that. Youth organizations and movements are the future, and you're a major part of the solution. So thanks so much. Now, dear friends, let's turn our eyes to the agenda and the program of work for the 5th session of the Forum. An annotated provisional agenda referenced as A/HRC/FD/2025/1 was shared in August this year. A final version of the program of work was sent to all permanent missions and posted on the Forum webpage last week. Compared to the annotated provisional agenda, the program of work contains one additional panel discussion entitled Legal Clarity, Democratic Defense, and Creativity. The whole meeting is now divided in 6 panels with a total of 53 panelists. In the spirit of Resolution 52/22, which highlights the importance of diverse participation, the list of panelists was prepared with a view to respect gender and geographical balance, as well as to give voice to youth, environmental human rights defenders, indigenous peoples, and other rights holders who are all critical to advocate for more democratic and human rights-based solutions to climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, looking more carefully at the program of work, you will see that today's first panel will consist in a multidisciplinary panel of experts who will examine anticipated possible futures, focusing on the interplay of climate change, their expert areas, human rights, rule of law, and democracy. The second panel, panelists will examine the right to participation and the role of key fundamental freedoms in the context of the climate crisis, particularly with respect to environmental human rights defenders. In particular, they will discuss whether and how such protection of rights is an enabler for effective climate policy. In the third panel, experts will interrogate the effectiveness, inclusivity, and adaptability of existing governance mechanisms, assess how they fit the scale, urgency, and complexity of the climate crisis, and where they fall short, including in protection of human rights. The fourth panel, to take place tomorrow, will explore how courts and regional mechanisms are addressing the challenges of climate change through policy and legal instruments, jurisprudence, and democratic processes. In the fifth panel, panelists will critically assess the initiatives that may delay urgently needed climate action or be harmful to people and the planet in the short and longer term. Panelists will also reflect on how human rights-based and inclusive approaches can maximize transition benefits. Finally, the sixth panel of the session will focus on integrated cross-sectoral solutions that recognize the systemic nature of the crisis and avoid siloed approaches. Also examining whether democracies are better equipped to identify and provide such solutions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our there any comments on this program of work? So I see none. So I take it then that the program of work for the 5th session of the Forum on Human Rights and Democracy and the Rule of Law is now adopted. It is so decided. Now, I would like now to quickly draw your attention to some practical information important for the smooth running of the forum. Let me first remind everyone that the use of photography or any other form of recording equipment is not permitted in the Palais des Nations, except by accredited members of the media. I would therefore be most grateful if you could kindly comply with this rule during the session. The list of speakers for each panel or focused discussion will open at the beginning of the respective debate. Member states are invited to raise their nameplates at the beginning of each panel discussion. NGOs and other representatives without nameplates are invited to come to the list of speakers desk here. Speaking time limit is 2 minutes for all participants. I kindly ask you to please respect the time limit in order to allow the maximum number of participants to take the floor. In my role as chair, I will strive to ensure that meetings begin on time and that speaking time limits are respected. In order to facilitate interpretation, written statements need to be sent to the Forum Secretariat by email. At ohchr-democracyforum@un.org with speeches at un.org in copy prior to the meeting during which they will be delivered. Now let's go into the substance. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to remind participants that this forum is a platform for constructive dialogue and exchange. While all views may be voiced in this forum, opinions may differ. I therefore call on all participants to avoid any disrespectful language and derogatory or inflammatory remarks, and to uphold United Nations standards and terminology when referring to countries and territories. I would like to stress the importance for the interventions from the floor to be pertinent to the topic under consideration. I therefore encourage everyone to provide concrete recommendations and to address specific questions to the panelists in order to stimulate dynamic and interactive discussions. In the course of the session, some delegations may wish to exercise a right of reply. As this is not a formal meeting of the Human Rights Council, there is no right of reply. However, out of courtesy, delegations wishing to take the floor in relation to a statement made by a previous speaker may be given the floor for a brief point of clarification at the end of the day, if time permits. I would also like to flag that a QR code is available to load a form, which offers an opportunity for all participants to contribute with additional inputs. Please feel free to include any additional recommendations, remarks, or suggestions you wish to see reflected in the forum's outcome document. I count on your cooperation in this important task of creating a dynamic, respectful, and interactive discussion. Moreover, I would like to inform you that 4 side events will take place during the lunch breaks of both days of the forum in rooms 11 and 12 of the Palais des Nations. Today, UNICEF, OHCHR, and CRIN will organize a side event entitled Right Here, Right Now, Children, Democracy, and Climate Action, with the participation of children from around the world. A documentary, Yumi, by the World's Youth for Climate Justice, will also be screened. It tells the inspiring story of law students who set out from the University of the South Pacific as part of a movement to take climate change to the International Court of Justice. Tomorrow, the OHCHR Environment and Climate Change Unit organizes, along with the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change, a global ethical stocktake on human rights, democracy, and climate change. The United Nations Development Programme and the International Foundation for Electoral Systems will, for their part, host an event entitled Elections for People and Planet, Intersection of Elections, Climate Change, and Environmental Protection. Further information about these events is available on the forum webpage. Flyers are also available in the corridor of this building. Last but not least, I would like to highlight the organization Aware Earth, who is supporting this session with their pro bono artistic activities. Let me praise also the Geneva-based artist Katia De Conti for the beautiful poster she designed for this session, which you can see on the screen. Additionally, the sculptor Clement Kovitsi will shape a ceramic globe in the corridor of the Tempus building during the 2 days of the session. You may have already seen him. He will present his final work at the closure of the session. Filmmaker Quentin Buja will also take photos and produce a short documentary on the session of the forum. Finally, Aware Earth will be undertaking a collaborative stamp mosaic. I encourage all participants to be part of this activity, which will continue outside the conference room through the 2 days. This said, let us move to the first panel of this forum. So participants. I hereby declare open the first panel of the 5th session of the United Nations Forum on Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law. Now, as indicated in the program of work, this panel will be a foresight exercise, focusing on climate change in a rule of law or a rule of law context. Firstly, let me outline the format of the panel. Each speaker has a maximum of 7 minutes for their presentation, anticipating possible futures with respect to the intersection of climate change and their expert areas within the broader framework of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. At the end, approximately 60 minutes will be reserved for questions and statements from the floor. The list of speakers is now open and will remain open during the whole panel discussion. I would like to introduce the panelists. We have with us on the platform Her Excellency Doreen de Bruin, Permanent Representative of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva. Dr. Manjana Milkorait, postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oslo's Department of Sociology and Human Geography. Ms. Anna Brach, Head of Human Security and Planetary Resilience at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Ms. Rebecca Willis, Professor in Energy and Climate Governance at Lancaster Environment Center. Mr. Sébastien Lehoude, Lecturer in Ethics, AI and Society at King's College, London. Esther Ndoishin, members of Ireland's Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. I now turn to Ms. Elisa Morguera, Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in the context of climate change, who will moderate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I just would like maybe to start by acknowledging the presence of so many states and experts in the room. This is, I think, a very exciting opportunity with the forum to really delve into some very complex and worrying questions, but at the same time really try and tap into our creative abilities, the full range of our cognitive skills to try and understand better what the challenges are ahead and how we can come together in overcoming them. And I would like very much thank and honor the organizers of the forum. I think they've been incredibly innovative in bringing together different approaches in the agenda, and I hope that this first panel will set the tone for that engaging conversation, reflection, and embracing of different areas of knowledge and understanding that can help us all navigate complex and maybe uncharted waters to some extent, but crucially also be as imaginative and leaning into transformation as much as we can here in this room for the next 2 days, but also in the months ahead, leading to the climate COP, leading to other important conversations here at also the Human Rights Forum and in Council and in many other engagements that you are involved in internationally and nationally. So this is a foresight exercise, and it means thinking about the future we may like to see. And often it is important to understand that in our present, we already have seeds of change. We also still have important presence of the past. And so it's important to be very explicit about our understandings of our present linked to the past and to the future, and to be very open to seeing any emerging of change and whether that is aligned to our desired future or maybe misaligned. And I think I've been very inspired recently by two Italian philosophers who have been advising about the idea of botany of wonder, how we behave in the context of quite terrifying present, I think, in a moment of chaos. And where do we look? We shouldn't look away, even if we are trying to look for comfort, but we should look, still look into difficult situations. And as they say, behave like botanists, look into what new plants may be growing, as they call it, in the cracks of chaos. And this is really important. We know that transformations don't happen necessarily from the top down. Often there are innovations from the bottom up, and connecting, recognizing those areas of innovation is what then allows for wider system transformation. And our role, I think, is both recognizing those opportunities, seeing if and how they may align to a shared desired future, and connect them with the global conversations we're part of. And crucially, I think, connect them with those legal clarifications that we have obtained from the International Court of Justice and other international tribunals on state obligations, on climate change, and particularly the role of human rights as a practice, as areas of evidence, as norms that can help us think through and have inclusive conversations around change and around future.
Here in the picture, these are some of the communities. They have placed black flags on buildings to voice their rejection of the mass lithium mining. Now, to conclude, I will have 3 forecasts based on the research I've done. Firstly, in the coming years, and including months, in fact, the environmental impact of AI will increase and will be more visible. However, an influential narrative will be fueled by big tech. And this will be AI exceptionalism, and this will be key to maintain and sustain survival on Earth. Some communities continue to focus on the important work done based on local environments. And in the process, they bring up important environmental questions. What voices in power will decide how the costs and benefits will be distributed? And lastly, we'll see an increasing technification of environmental action. On this panel, we mentioned engineering. These initiatives will have an impact on the world and will depend on the value chain. As this occurs, different types of tensions and opposition or alternatives will emerge from different parts of the planet. The cases that I mentioned show that in accelerated technological developments, the needs of local communities are necessary to ensure sustainable environments. And I'm very pleased to see that this message has been echoed in the previous presentations of panelists. Thank you very much.
Sebastian, thank you so much. I think that was really inspiring and providing such a full range of opportunities and risks that we have before us. Again, some elements already very visible in the present, particularly in terms of that AI exceptionalism, and I think linked to already other logics of sacrifice that unfortunately have shaped some of our responses to climate change, but also those aspects of community-led use of technologies and how that can be transformative, both in terms of knowledge co-production and making technologies very rooted and responsive to contextual situations. So I really appreciate all those inputs, and I'm sure that we'll have a thorough discussion as we get to that point. But before we do so, we have an incredible privilege, and we're so lucky today to welcome on our panel Esther and Oshin from Ireland. Personally, I've been following their work as part of the Children and Young People Assembly in Ireland with a lot of hope and inspiration. We have heard already in the panel how important citizens' assembly are, and now we can hear directly from them about their experience in living that very process. And in particular, I think for all of us adults in the room, I would invite you to reflect about the transformative power of fulfilling children's rights to be heard as transformations for us adults, and the processes that we can have the privilege of experiences with children and young people that can really help us expand our understanding, our imagination, and that capacity to develop meaningful climate action. So with that, Esther and Oshin, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me. Growing up, I always used to see and hear about all the people affected by climate change. More often than not, it was people far away from me who were affected the most. But occasionally, I would hear about flooding in Ireland and how people were losing all their belongings, like their cars, furniture, and even their businesses. I think I was about 6 years old, and my granddad was living with me, and he used to tell me stories about when he was young. It was around then that I realized climate change was a problem, especially when my parents brought me into Fermoy, my local town, to see a big flood that had happened there. I knew then something wasn't right and inherently wrong. Climate change is already impacting children's future, and it will impact their children's future too. This can happen in different ways. It can be to do with children's local infrastructure, like flooded roads stopping them from attending school, or their parents getting to work, or their family's food crops failing because of drought or flooding. These are all linked to climate change, which makes bad weather worse. This can have a greater impact on those who already have less or are in a disadvantaged position. They also impact people's health, both mentally and physically. Food is so important to us all, and climate change can disrupt the growing, cultivating, and sharing of that food. This is unfair, as every child has the right to grow up happy, healthy, and safe. But climate change is making this very difficult for many children to experience their basic human rights. It is important to listen to children's voices, because we will be the worst impacted by climate change, compared to the 1% profiting off the planet's demise. And we will likely have to clean up the mess if it is not already too late. So how can leaders truly listen to children's voices in climate decisions? Voting is not the only way children can have a voice. We need to find other ways to include children in democracy. One example of this I want to talk about is having children participate in citizens' assemblies, a participation process where members of the public are randomly selected to learn about an issue such as climate change, deliberating this together and come up with recommendations that go straight to government. I learned this from my own experience being involved in the Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss in Ireland. 3 years ago, when I was 10 years old, I was randomly selected by a democratic lottery to join the Citizens' Assembly, along with 35 other children and young people aged 7 to 17 from across the country. Our assembly ran in parallel to the Citizens' Assembly, taking place with 100 randomly selected adults in Ireland at the same time. Over 2 weekends, each gathering was held in a different national park in Ireland. We came together to learn about biodiversity loss and to discuss and create recommendations, or what we called calls to action. For the Irish government, we learned by speaking with biodiversity and climate experts, playing games, getting creative through role-play and art, and getting outside on nature walks. My favourite part was meeting Minister Malcolm Noonan and speaking to someone at the very top of Irish government. At the end of the assembly, we came up with 58 calls to action and 6 key messages. Oisin will tell you about some of our ideas in a moment. We presented these to Minister Malcolm Noonan who was responsible for biodiversity restoration in Ireland at the time and who commissioned the Assembly. I also was one of the Assembly members who took our calls to action to the Adults Citizens Assembly and told them what we thought. Our recommendations were included in their final report too. Since then, I have learned how the government has responded to our recommendations. At the end of the year, the government got back to us all about what they have been doing in response to the Assembly. They shared that they have already implemented 3 of the calls to action and are working on implementing 52 others. Only 3 calls to action have not been implemented, and the government has given an explanation why. I think our Assembly is a very good case study on how to bring children's voices and ideas directly into government democratic decision-making. For example, one of the key messages is something that I wrote, which other Assembly members agreed with. We must treat the earth like a member of the family or a friend. This was used by our Taoiseach, that's our Prime Minister in Ireland, when he was speaking about the work of the citizens' assemblies. This is something that all governments should do in the future when thinking about how to improve children's rights.
Thank you, everyone. I realized that climate change was a major issue when I noticed an increase in both the frequency and severity of storms in Ireland. The most recent example that I personally experienced was when Storm Éowyn hit the country earlier this year. It was one of the most severe weather events in Ireland's recent history. It damaged homes and communities, and in some rural areas, electricity was lost for weeks. For me, this storm acted as a wake-up call, a reminder that climate change is not some distant problem. It is here, and it is happening now. As a 16-year-old, I have grown up hearing the term climate change everywhere. Sometimes I fear that these words are thrown around too loosely, as if they are just mere slogans, and that many people still do not grasp the true severity of what is happening, or the everyday harm that we cause by our actions. My perspective changed when I, like Esther, was also randomly selected to participate in Ireland's Children and Young People's Assembly on biodiversity loss in 2022. For the first time, I sat in a room with children and young people from across the country. We shared our experiences and our concerns. And I realized that even though we were all from the same small island, climate change and biodiversity loss were already shaping our lives in very different ways. Through the Assembly, we show that it's possible for children and young people to be heard. Children aged 7 to 17 participated in this Assembly. We came together, listened to each other, and created clear recommendations for the Irish government. The Assembly proved that when young people are given the time, respect, and support that we need, we can make meaningful contributions to policy. This Assembly provided us with all three of these things. However, in too many places, children's rights are still not respected or their voices even heard. How can we speak of justice in a world where millions of young people feel their voices do not matter or fear that they will simply be ignored? Under 18s make up 1/3 of the world's population, and our voices are being silenced and our rights ignored. This cannot be allowed to continue. If we want a world built on justice, then listening to children and young people is not optional. It is essential. Esther has already mentioned that these issues will have an impact on our future. So I'm going to walk you through the ways that the future could be different, from both the collective point of view of all of the Assembly members and from my own personal vision of the future. At the Assembly, we all collaborated to create a version for the future in Ireland. This vision was included in our final report, and it speaks of an Ireland where we are connected to and care for the rights of nature and each other, so that biodiversity is restored and protected, and we live and grow up in healthy, clean, and fair environments. This vision shows our collective desire to live in a place that respects nature and takes our voices seriously. The Assembly aided us in taking a significant step towards achieving this. Now for my vision of the future. The future for not just Ireland, but for the world. I would like everyone in this room to imagine a world where the air smells fresh and clean, a world where the forests and woodlands are alive with the singing of birds and animals, and the rivers are clean and full of fish, a world where children know that their opinions matter. All of us involved in the Assembly can agree that our experience has taught us something powerful. That when young people come together, we do not just bring opinions. We also bring hope, creativity, and determination. We are ready to help design solutions, but we need leaders to open the doors to allow us to do so. But if these doors are opened, these visions do not need to remain hypothetical. They can become a possibility that we can all create, children and adults together. But it starts with being the opportunity to have our say. If there is one thing I would like you to take away from this speech, is this. We may be young, but we do have a voice, and the solutions we bring are too important to be ignored. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Esther and Oshin. I think that was, first of all, incredible delivery. I have lots to learn from you about how to speak in those settings. But also, I think more importantly, that example of intergenerational co-development of a vision for the present and the future. And also, I think, an expression of support for Ireland, for having been reacting and been still in conversation with you, that coming back to you to let you know which recommendations are being implemented, and if some are not, why. I think that's so crucial. And it showed that this is an iterative process. It started with those citizens' assembly, just seeing how adults took up your recommendations in itself is an incredible demonstration of how much adults have to learn and benefit from your contributions. But also, I would just like to take a moment to also emphasize the role of art and play, being in nature as, key methodologies that were used for your work, and how also with this forum, and I think so much more should be done at the UN to create those conditions. Those are the conditions for us to be able to think creatively, imaginatively, and in transformative ways about the challenges of the present, and being able to also identify those seeds of transformative change that are here. We will hear more about this experience at the lunch break side event. And we'll have, I think, some of the colleagues from Irish government as well who will be there to share their experience. So I hope many of you will be there, and otherwise we'll find other ways to bring, I think, that learning and hope across our conversations over the next 2 days. And with that, I'll pass the floor back to the chairperson. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks to all the speakers for this interesting, rather frightening and moving ambassador discussion. Now, I'm going to open the segment of the list of speakers. Country representatives will speak first, and then we'll go to NGOs. Everybody has 2 minutes for their interventions. If there is time, I do have some questions myself to the panel, and which I'd like to go forward. So now I give the floor to Romania to make a joint statement on behalf of the pen holders of the resolution. Thank you.
Mr. President, distinguished participants, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Morocco, Norway, Peru, the Republic of Korea, Tunisia, and my own country, Romania, members of the core group of the resolutions on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The core group warmly welcomes this 5th session of the forum. Amid of the current severe financial constraints and after being postponed, its organization this year is the result of great efforts by the OECHR. This is well recognized and appreciated.
The speakers requested to slow down.
Sharing so relevant insights on the themes brought under consideration. We are grateful to OECHR for drafting a rich agenda that mirrors the spirit and objectives pursued by the co-authors of the mandating resolutions. We are confident that this will allow participants to bring to the fore meaningful perspectives on climate-related topics essential in ensuring the respect of the individual rights and freedoms and the promotion of democracy and the rule of law. It is the core group's conviction that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are independent and mutually reinforcing. This should be the basic prerequisites in framing the debates about solutions to one of the major challenges of our times, climate changes. In addressing its impact, states should design sustainable and effective climate actions that fully respect, promote, and fulfill human rights and could contribute to strengthening our democracies. Climate change affects directly and indirectly the life and the full enjoyment of a large array of human rights. As part of all walks of life, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being, to freedoms of opinion, expressions, peaceful assembly, and association, and is entitled to contribute to solutions benefiting both nature and human beings for generations to come. We trust this forum will offer a safe space for debates on innovative thinking about how to efficiently promote information integrity on this subject matter and how states and each of us could contribute meaningfully within the framework of democracy and human rights to the design and improvement of climate policies meant to mitigate the adverse effects of climate events on human rights. Thank you.
Thanks to the distinguished representative of Romania for that statement. And now I give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My delegation associates itself with the delegation that was delivered by the permanent representative of Romania on behalf of the core group of the Human Rights Council resolution on human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, of which Tunisia is a member. We commend the holding of the 5th session of the forum in implementation of the aforementioned Human Rights Council resolution, and we thank the panelists for their valuable intervention. We renew on this occasion the interdependence between human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, and that the democratic system and the respect of the supremacy and the rule of law are the optimal framework to protect human rights and to face the current global challenges, including climate change, that are a major threat to our planet and the existence of humanity at large, which requires that we depend on democratic institutions in the drafting and the implementation of policies to address climate change under the rule of law and transparency. Tunisia also reaffirms in this respect its commitment to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and it's considered to be among the countries that are most affected by the repercussions of climate change, as it suffers from scarce rainfall, drought, and the scarcity of potable water, as well as the rise in temperatures. In the framework of its abidance by its international commitments and its national efforts to combat and adapt with climate change, it has adopted in 2023 a national strategy for ecological transition that contains more than 53 processes on 5 main pillars in order to establish a territorial, multi-sectoral, systematic institutional governments. Thank you.
I now give the floor to Jordan, to be followed by Iraq. I don't see Jordan taking the floor, so we'll go to the distinguished representative of Iraq, to be followed by Cuba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are pleased to take part in this important forum, and we thank the distinguished panelists. We would like, in this respect, to stress the commitment of Iraq to achieve its climate objectives in accordance with its nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and the implementation of projects and initiatives that contribute in reducing emissions and achieving the SDGs. We are aware that facing climate change requires a favorable environment that allows the development and the implementation of effective policies nationally, regionally, and internationally. But we also have to face the challenges that are related to democracy, such as the low pace of decision-making as a result of the different policies that obstruct the rapid response to environmental crises. And a number of reports have alluded to the fact that the negative impacts of climate change vary between groups, especially women, the poor, and also geographic disparities, which make it essential to adopt solutions that depend on human rights, fairness, and equity, as well as promoting human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Iraq has prepared a package of national instruments and strategies that are concerned with the gradual and safe transition of energy and the diversification of the sources of the economy and the use of low carbon technologies while focusing on increasing the flexibility of different sectors to adapt with climate change. Thank you.
Thanks to the distinguished representative of Iraq. I now give the floor to Cuba, to be followed by Greece.
Señor Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Climate change is an existential threat to humanity, disproportionately affecting the countries of the South. Cuba and other Caribbean nations have been particularly affected. By hydrometeorological severe events, which have become more frequent in the last decade. Responsibilities are shared but differentiated, not the same for all. The industrialized countries must fulfill their commitments on climate change with implementation and operationalization for the loss and damage mechanism. Cuba reaffirms that democracy cannot be a single model. It must respect self-determination of peoples and diverse political systems without interference in countries' sovereignty. As defined in our constitution, Cuba is a socialist state with social justice, the rule of law, development, and addressing climate change are specifically interrelated. The rule of law in national and international plans are crucial for sustained economic
growth which is inclusive, sustainable development, poverty and hunger eradication, and enjoyment of all human rights. We reiterate our support to the GA statement on the rule of law in national and international plans, under which unilateral coercive measures are incompatible with the rule of law and human rights, and the blockade against Cuba by the US undermines the country's capacity to address climate change, particularly in energy, transport, and other sectors. These measures supposedly connected with terrorism undermine the necessary investment for addressing climate change. Thank you.
Thanks to the distinguished representative of Cuba. I now give the floor to Greece, to be followed by the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome the fifth session of this forum. The climate crisis we face today poses a profound challenge to humanity and the planet. To respond effectively, human rights must be fully integrated into climate policies, and people must be empowered to participate in their design and implementation. This ensures sustainability, coherence, and alignment with human rights obligations through participation, transparency, accountability, education, and access to information. For Greece, protecting human rights and addressing climate change are fundamental priorities. We attach particular importance to democratic institutions, the rule of law, and fundamental freedoms, principles enshrined in our Constitution. Article 24 guarantees the right to a healthy environment and the state's duty to protect it. In this spirit, Greece ratified the Aarhus Convention in 2005, ensuring access to environmental information, public participation, and justice in environmental matters. Environmental education is embedded at all levels of schooling, raising awareness among younger generations. As an EU member, Greece implements the European climate law, which makes climate neutrality by 2050 a legally binding goal. In line with this, Greece has adopted its own national climate law, establishing clear emission reduction targets and a roadmap consistent with EU objectives. This framework ensures that climate action is legally enforceable and subject to judicial review. Moreover, under the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, companies operating in the single market must respect human rights and climate standards throughout their value chains, turning principles into practice. As an elected non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for 2025-2026, Greece has also placed climate, peace, security nexus among its priorities. Looking ahead, strengthening the rule of law is essential to ensure climate action remains fair, inclusive, and rights-based. Distinguished panelists, which institutional innovations or mechanisms do you consider more promising to safeguard human rights and climate action, particularly where the rule of law is weak? Thank you.
Thank you, Greece. And now I give the floor to the European Union, to be followed by Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'd like to thank the panelists for this discussion. Addressing these challenges requires robust environmental policies and democratic institutions that uphold the rule of law and foster inclusive participation. Climate change and environmental degradation represent an acute challenge for the full and effective enjoyment of human rights worldwide, disproportionately affecting persons in vulnerable situations. SIDS and least developed countries are particularly exposed. The unit's member states remain firmly committed to addressing the multifaceted climate crisis. As the largest contributors of public climate finance, we work closely with developing countries to support their efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We also support a renewed finance framework to scale up all sources of climate finance and reiterate our commitment to the objectives of the UNFCCC and the goals of the Paris Agreement. The European Green Deal remains our roadmap to a climate neutral economy by 2050. It is a robust legal framework built on the principles of inclusive and participatory governance, transparency and accountability, as well as a just transition. Democratic societies are built on transparent and accountable institutions, representative parliaments, and engaged citizens. They provide a safe and enabling environment for civil society, human rights defenders, and the free, independent, and pluralistic media to voice concerns, influence policies, monitor decision makers, and hold them accountable. Without them, we will not be able to address effectively the triple planetary crisis and strengthen our resilience by an inclusive and just transition. Strong, transparent legal frameworks and governance systems are indispensable to ensure that environmental policies respect human rights and are designed and implemented in a fair, inclusive, and just manner. Upholding the rule of law and democratic principles strengthens public trust and enhances the legitimacy and effectiveness of climate action, benefiting the rights of everyone. I thank you.
Thanks to the European Union. We now give the floor to Algeria, to be followed by South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, we'd like to thank the Forum for the timely theme of climate change and join other delegations in thanking the panelists for their insightful interventions. We particularly commend the Forum's focus on solutions to climate change in this session, as there have been more and more attempts recently to target and single out fossil fuels and introduce prescriptive language about them into human rights resolutions and discussions, disregarding the relevant international binding instruments, mainly the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and overlooking the legitimate development and energy needs of developing countries. We all agree on the real challenges faced by developing countries, who are the least responsible for historical emissions, in addressing the adverse effects of climate change, especially on the enjoyment of human rights. In this regard, would like to stress that all initiatives, be it resolutions or discussions dealing with states' human rights obligations with regards to addressing the adverse impacts of climate change, should account for the diversity of national contexts, circumstances, priorities, and capabilities, and support the right to development. Second, more should be said about the obligation to mobilize climate finance as rooted in the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, including grant-based resources and highly concessional finance. We believe that climate finance is central to ensuring climate justice, equity, and the right to development. Historical responsibilities for climate change should not be overlooked, and the burden of action should not be shifted into those least responsible for historical emissions. Finally, we stress that climate action should respect the sovereign rights of states to determine their national pathways and uphold the principles of equity, common but differentiated responsibilities, and respective capabilities as recognized in the UNFCCC and reaffirmed in the Paris Agreement. I thank you.
Thank you, distinguished representative of Algeria. And now we give the floor to South Africa, to be followed by the Dominican Republic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. We would like to thank the Office of the High Commissioner for organizing this event, but also thank the panelists for their valuable insights we've had this morning. South Africa reaffirms the need to build peaceful, just, and inclusive societies that provide equal access to justice and that are based on respect for human rights, rule of law, and good governance at all levels, as well as on transparent and effective, as well as accountable institutions. My delegation supports the popular view that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law create an enabling environment in which countries can promote sustainable development, protect individuals from discrimination, and ensure equal access to justice for all. We reaffirm that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. Indeed, in interrogating the linkage between human rights, climate change, and environmental protection, we need to adopt a human rights-based, gender-responsive, and intersectional approach. Chairperson, the theme for this session cannot be more fitting as the synergy between the climate crisis
deepens. Environmental racism is not an accident. It is the product of governance structures that normalize exclusion. Entire communities of people of African descent, especially in Latin America, are displaced from their territories, denied access to housing, sanitation, and safe environments, and pushed to the front lines of the climate collapse. This exposes a deeper truth. climate change is not neutral. It magnifies inequalities already embedded in our society. The working group of experts on people of African descent in the last report presented to the HRC is clear. The colonial legacy requires reparatory justice. And the COP16 in Cali, Colombia last year was a milestone for the reparatory justice agenda, as it explicitly recognized people of African descent within the interpretation of Article 8J of the Convention of Biological Diversity. The African Union has declared this year as the year of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. This reminds us that the rule of law must also include historical accountability. And last but not least, it also reminds us that aligning financial flows with climate resilience must also mean aligning with justice, redress, and human dignity. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And that ends our list of speakers. Now I'd like to give the floor back to the Special Rapporteur as moderator.
Thank you. I think there were 3 questions that were posed, as well as many inputs and comments. One about what are the most promising approaches when the rule of law is weak. Just one right now around our reflections on rule of law, democracy in the context of political extremism. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists wishes to provide further insights. If there's any. Yes, please go ahead.
So I just wanted to address the question of the most promising approaches. And what I've seen, I think we overemphasize investments in new technologies in this area that may, in a way, and it was mentioned here, marginalize increasingly an increasing number of people. This is why what I really insist upon, and what we can see in the research as well, is working on the nature-based solutions that are existent and have been mentioned here, provided by the indigenous peoples, empowering local populations. I know that it is very difficult in the context of weak rule of law, but these efforts can be made on local levels and can be kind of bottom-up approaches that can work. What's problematic in this is that we tend to get excited about new technologies and invest a lot in those solutions, rather than scaling up the solutions that are provided by indigenous communities, by local populations, that could be really beneficial in terms of creating carbon sinks, in terms of improving land regeneration. And one last point, just I wanted to plug an event that the GCSP is organizing in the context of the Geneva Peace Week that's happening this week in the Maison de la Paix, where we will be talking about land restoration. It's happening on Thursday at 11 at the GCSP, so you're most welcome to come and have a conversation about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Thank you. In terms of institutions, over the past 5 years, there's been an incredible flourishing in deliberative approaches to climate governance with citizens assemblies at the national level and also at the very local level, and also civil society run. And I think that these can be adopted even when institutions are weak. It is both a very visible promotion of democratic norms and values, but also an excellent way to get input from citizens as to what sorts of climate strategies and what kinds of policies and governance work in very different situations. And there's a link too, I think, to the question about extremism, because it's very clear from the evidence that extremism flourishes in situations of democratic distrust, when there's a lack of accountability, and when citizens feel that their voices aren't being heard. But if you look across different demographics, it's very clear that the majority of populations are actually turning away from the political process. They're not necessarily turning to extremism, but more a kind of resigned fatalism. And that, you know, making sure that we include those people who are, you know, at the moment a silent majority is really, really important in bolstering democratic accountability and norms.
Thank you. Just checking if, yes, so Ambassador de Brum, and then Maliana.
Thank you. There are a couple of things from the discussions and questions that I wanted to return to. So first, there was the question about which institutions we just should turn to when the rule of law is weak. And the second one, the question of how we ensure that states that are most susceptible to climate change effects are not marginalized and left to tend for themselves. I think to some extent the answers to these questions are linked. The Marshall Islands has been involved in climate negotiations for a long time. We've seen climate change happen for more than 20 years. And we've lived it for more than 20 years. And every time things get tough. We hear people say the UNFCCC is dead, that multilateralism has broken down, that we need to find radical new instruments. But we don't think that changes the fundamentals about what we need. We need all countries at the table in a formal body. Put simply, if we didn't have the UNFCCC, we'd start again and find we needed to build the same thing all over again. At the same time, we should use all the tools we have. We're a member of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. We gave evidence to the ICJ for these reasons. But let's not throw away the institutions we've spent years building. Just at the time, we need that kind of multilateralism more than ever.
Thank you so much. Mariana?
Yeah, I also would like to speak to the question of what institutional models or innovations are promising. And I want to address in particular the need for strengthening our anticipatory, forward-looking capacities, because that is so vital to understand what is happening on the planet, in the climate, and in our societies, to understand those trends and to be able to have access to that information, to those understandings of possible futures, and to act on those. And so I think there are probably three things that are important here. One is that we do need science, policy, society, institutions that are more agile, more permanent, more able to bring together relevant science, indigenous knowledge, and stakeholders in a permanent co-production of understanding of where these Earth systems are at. And how they're moving and whether they're approaching tipping points. So what's the state of the Earth we're trying to address, and to bring that into our decision making in a more effective manner. Second, then, to become more anticipatory and long or forward looking, we have are experimenting with representations of future generations' institutions. So that needs to grow. Right? We see lots of good examples, recent examples of where that is being applied and tested. That is a very concrete way of bringing voices of future generations, but maybe also of other species into the decision-making process. process. I think that is a very promising avenue too. And third, and important component of anticipatory action is also to remove financial interests from these kinds of debates. Because they are driving short-termism, right? So they're removing the attention to future time horizons that matter in these choices.
Thank you so much. Just a final check to see if anyone else wants to chip in. Otherwise, I think I'll complement these reflections, maybe taking as an example the crucial questions of whether we should have conversations about fossil fuels here and elsewhere, very much acknowledging that those conversations are difficult, but that again, a democratic process would be one at every level, would be one where we are able to bring together all relevant bodies of knowledge, obviously climate science, which is quite clear on the question of the contribution of fossil fuels to climate change, but also other areas of sciences, including from biodiversity, showing how fossil fuels are at the root cause of the other interlinked planetary crises, biodiversity loss, toxic pollution, and economic inequality. And yet another body of science that I think is very crucial for citizens, decision makers, taxpayers to engage with, which is health science, and what it tells us about the impacts of a fossil fuel-based economy at every stage of our lives, at every stage of development, exploration, exploitation, transport, waste management of fossil fuels, and using the evidence for a very inclusive conversation around whether or not that model supports the right to development, whether it supports our right to a healthy environment, and whether it supports the protection of all human rights that are interdependent and can't be realized without fully respecting each and every human right. And I think that that really shows how every opportunity for that dialogue should be seized and supported, and where, you know, depending on which where each state is standing in the context of the crucial question, being open to hear to all those perspectives, those scientific evidence, and also the lived experience of its own citizens in other parts of the world will only expand the areas of understanding that can lead to decisions that are fully respectful of human rights, and on that basis provide for the best opportunities for realizing the right to development in each and every country. And I think that the ICJ has really shown how there are multiple areas of international law, which of course are shaped with those multiple areas of science, that need to be respected in the context of the decisions we make on fossil fuel extraction, consumption, fossil fuel subsidies, and that legal guidance has been said throughout, I think, the morning, is responding to lived experiences, is responding to multiple bodies of available science, and is providing an important indication for understanding where we are at with the law, with state accountability. And through that, I think is really shining maybe a new light on the aspect of international climate finance and international cooperation, which has been raised also in the context of this discussion, really thinking about the priorities in terms of scientific cooperation, what kind of finance should be addressed and should be provided for opportunities for all countries, if possible, to leapfrog into a renewable-based economy that can prevent those foreseeable and widely documented human rights violations that seem to be very tightly linked with a fossil fuel-based economy. So I'll stop there, and thanks all the participants for that rich conversation.
Yes, thanks so much to all the participants. Now we've come to an end of this panel. Before I formally close, I would like to remind everybody that we have two side events now in the lunch break. The first starts at 1:45, 1:45. It's the event Right Here, Right Now, Children, Democracy, and Climate Action. The second starts earlier at 1:15, and that's the documentary Yumi by the World's Youth for Climate Justice. So thank you so much, and see you this afternoon.